dedicated to each and every one of you who appreciate a great glass of wine. You know what I mean?
It's Monday. Let's raise a glass to the beginning of another week. It's time to unscrew, uncork, or saber a bottle. And let's begin exploring the wine glass. I registered for the Old Vine Conference, which took place online in mid-October. The concept of old vines is an intriguing one since in the U.S. there is no legal definition. However, in certain wine regions, they are creating categories to distinguish these vines. The conference is a partnership between the Old Vine Conference and the Zinfandel Advocates and Producers. This conference took place over 2 days and had several sessions that I am excited to be able to share with you. The first one is about the economic sustainability of old vine wines in South Africa. While you're listening, it would be greatly appreciated if you could take 1 minute to subscribe, rate, and review. It takes only a few seconds of your time but means so much to the show. Also, please be sure to check the box for automatic downloads so that new episodes of Exploring the Wine Glass show up in your next up feed. The next best way to support Exploring the Wine Glass is to tell your friends. If you enjoy the podcast, your wine-loving friends will too. Follow me on all the socials. And finally, don't forget to head to the website exploringthewineglass.com to read the blog, sign up for the newsletter, and keep up on all happenings. Sláinte!
Give me the wine.
Hey everybody, I'm Lori Budd, a UC Davis winemaking program, Spanish wine scholar, sommelier service, champagne and Côte d'Aron specialist, and a WSET Level 2 graduate. You can find Exploring the Wine Glass on all the socials as well as your favorite podcast catchers. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the perfect time to swipe, subscribe, rate, and review. Stay in the know about all things wine by visiting my website, exploringthewineglass.com. I promise I'll never tell you what to drink, but I'll always share what's in my glass.
Irish coffee.
So I'm honoured to be chairing this 6th edition of the Old Vine Conference over the course of the next 2 days. Thank you all for joining and for being part of this really important conversation on the future of old vines and I think of the wine industry as seen through the old vine lens. It's fortifying to see so many committed professionals coming together to share knowledge, insights, and their dedication to nurturing old vines. It's been an exciting and impactful year for us at the Old Vine Conference. We've seen real progress in both awareness and action. More producers than ever are coming together to protect these heritage vineyards, recognising not only their cultural and historical significance, but also their importance to biodiversity and wine quality. At the Old Vine Conference, we've forged new partnerships with wine regions and other institutions, and we held our first national chapter event in Italy when 22 brilliant Italian wine producers came together from all over the country. And it's wonderful to see this regional and national nexus kind of emerging in such an important country for old vines. We look forward to this happening in other countries of the world as well. In partnership with Jancis Robinson's Old Vine Registry, we launched a Heritage Vine Hunt this year to catalogue 10,000 vineyards on the Old Vine Registry over the next 3 years. Please take a look at oldvineregistry.org to see our progress and also to see how you can take part. The global conversation recognising the value of old vines is growing, and it's thanks to all of you, our partners, supporters, producers, consumers and advocates. I thank our growing network of supporters and sponsors. I also thank our growing team of volunteer regional ambassadors, and I must thank my colleague and co-founder, Belinda Stone, for her exceptional work in growing our membership and delivering our events and content with such impact and flair. So this year's conference promises to be our most dynamic yet. Over the next 2 days, we'll be hearing from some of the leading voices in the wine industry, from vineyard owners to researchers and marketers who are expanding our understanding of the wisdom and value to be unlocked from old vines. We're going to be exploring the economic sustainability of these vineyards, the environmental sustainability, and as well as innovative practices for preserving them and their genomes, and explore how we can continue to build consumer awareness of their unique and priceless value. These sessions are about more than just sharing knowledge. Together, we are connecting and creating a network and a movement to ensure that this priceless resource and the mentality it embodies can thrive for the future. I'm delighted to introduce our first speakers, Kathy Van Ziel, Master of Wine, and Dr. Jonathan Steen. Kathy is the recently appointed director of the South African Old Vine Project. This is just the latest position in her luminous CV. The Old Vine Project is a visionary and inspiring initiative started by Rosa Kruger 20 years ago to nurture South African heritage vineyards. Kathy is joined by Dr. Jonathan Steen. He holds a doctorate in business administration and international masters in wine marketing and business, and is based at the University of Cape Town Graduate School. Jonathan is a strategic advisor and research partner to the South African Old Vine Project, and under his guidance, the South African Old Vine Project has been able to complete extremely valuable research quantifying the value that can be unlocked from old vine wine as a category, as well as stimulate ongoing research, including an upcoming master's research program. Their session explores the value of South African old vine category and shares research on the potential of this category to unlock economic sustainability. Thank you so much, and over to you, Kathy and Jonathan.
Good afternoon, Sarah, and thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone around the world. Sarah, just to you and Amanda, thank you so much for working so hard with old vine organizations around the world to promote our collective calling. Since its inception, the Old Vines Project in South Africa has had the goal of preserving old vine vineyards for the benefit of generations to come. In South Africa, this translates into preserving vineyards that are 35 years and older. In order to progress towards this goal, we are currently working on 3 areas. 1, we are building an appreciation for wines made from old vines amongst consumers, so that we hope to encourage them to pay more sustainable prices for these wines, which in turn will encourage wine growers and farmers to keep old vines in the ground. The activities which are central to this task include driving the uptake of our certified heritage vineyard seal and educating consumers and the industry of its existence and of its purpose. Our second main area of focus is inspiring a behavior of planting and farming to grow old. This involves sharing knowledge with our members about, for example, how climate change is going to impact their little piece of dirt, viticultural best practices, and so on. Importantly, it also includes training vineyard workers how to adapt their pruning techniques and other vineyard tasks to protect old vines in the vineyards. Third, we are intent on enabling, participating, commissioning, piggybacking, you name it, research which gives us a better understanding of old vines and their place in the wine world. Examples of our past, present, and future work in this area include a study on living heritage, climate change, and sustainability in South African agriculture. This is a collaboration between the Old Vine Project, Stellenbosch University, and the British Academy. Another recent collaboration is a project in its foundation phase. It's going to be the search for the answer, why some vineyards grow old and why some don't. It also includes research done, for example, on the chemical makeup of juice and wines from young and old vineyards, like this done in 2018, looking at Pinotage. This research has just been repeated with the 2024 vintage, using old and young Grenache vineyards and old and young Chenin Blanc vineyards. Interesting to us is that we've also added a sensory perception component to the research this time around. And a large portion of the research that we are doing is done to understand how this new marketing segment we have created using our Heritage Vine Seal has impacted the South African wine industry and also impacted the wine markets. We want to know how consumers in the category react to the seal, or how they react to the words Old Vines on the label, how that impacts their purchasing habits, and what financial impact that all has for the Old Vine wine grower, because that is what's going to keep old vines in the ground. So this final space is Dr. Jonathan Staines' playground. So in keeping with the theme of this seminar, which is research, research, and research, I'm going to hand over to the researcher so that he can share with you what he has been up to.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and thank you, Sarah, very much for the invitation. What a privilege to speak to so many people from all across the world. I just saw some messages in the chat from Mexico, from Portugal, Southern California. Wonderful to share a little bit about our work in South Africa on old vines. So I just want to share my screen quickly. And I'll just play from start. So Kathy and Sarah asked me just to talk a little bit about economic sustainability of South Africa's old vineyard wines. And I've been working with the Old Vine Project in South Africa almost since the inception in 2017. And one of the things we wanted to really research from a South African industry point of view was to determine whether the old vines category added anything in terms of value to a bottle of wine. Now, it would have been a very short research project if we had in fact found that there was not much impact in terms of value of the old vine category. But fortunately, we did find that, in fact, the old vine Q on a bottle of wine did add to the price of a bottle of wine. So I think before we delve into the research, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what sustainability means, perhaps, just to set the scene. So I think there's two kind of concepts that we can look at. The first is organization facing, which is a very well-known concept called the triple bottom line, which means that organization must embed social, environmental, and economic purpose and balance these in their organizations because it's not only about profit, there are other bottom lines. It must be good for people and it must be good for planet. But that is organization facing. And then what we're looking at is sort of the market facing aspect. And there we talk about blended value. And that's really about a value proposition. So value proposition is really what makes you attractive, what makes your wine attractive to consumers. And we're going to talk a little bit about generational change as we advance through our presentation. Just a little bit about what our research is confronting. So we started sort of here at the consumer exchange point. So our first study, which I'll share the results of, really looked at the value of the old vines Q on a bottle of wine. That was a cross-sectional study, which means we did it at a certain point in time. We collected that data in about 2018. But we have repeated collections of this data, and we are now busy putting that research together where we can look at how each of these categories have performed over time, including the old vineyard category. And then we've also looked at what drives consumer behavior, and are they prepared to purchase wines in the old vine category? And we of course looked at South African old vines, but we are looking to expand this internationally and also look at various markets. And then we looked at the impact that the Old Vine Project, the Old Vine category, which we feel is a relatively high status or a premium category, really affects other associated categories like Chenin Blanc, for example. One of the studies that someone in my team is embarking on, as Sarah mentioned, was a production study to look at what was impacting the price for old vine grapes between producers and growers. And there we're looking at the impact of power, trust, and uncertainty on the way in which old vine grapes are either premiumized or discounted. And some really interesting results coming for that. Hopefully in future international conferences we can share that. But the point of this was that if there was value created at the exchange point in the market, then there was potential to drive impact and premiums, which then could be used to advance social and environmental purpose, and so forth. The problem is if value is being extracted out of the value chain at any point, it defeats the point of selling old vines on the market and generating a premium. It certainly is a premium category from what we can look at.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Looking for a unique wine tasting experience? Look no further than Dracaena Wines' tasting room in downtown Paso Robles. Located on the corner of 13th and Pine, this charming spot is not your average winery. Founded by passionate wine lovers who also happen to be the brains behind Cab Franc Day, Dracaena Wines is proud to call themselves home of Blanc de Franc. This crisp and elegant white wine has gained a cult following and is just one example of their superb offerings. With over 10 years of consistently receiving 90+ ratings from top critics, these wines are sure to impress even the most discerning palates. So come raise a glass with us and celebrate great wines at Dracaena Wines' tasting room.
So when we were sort of trying to understand this, this whole phenomenon, how we were going to approach it, we had to look at how categories were formed. And the South African Old Vine project was really, I think, instrumental in shaping a category for old vineyards, although the attribute had been around for several years, especially internationally. It hadn't really been formalized. So attributes are really claims. And so if you look at something called characteristics, those are just subjective claims. So there's a bottle of Kleiner also Family Reserve. So a Family Reserve is just a subjective claim. What does that mean? But it also states on the bottle that it's an old vineyard wine. The vineyards are 40 years old. But until these claims become measured by some sort of objective criteria, so for example, certified heritage vineyard seal, or in Rioja, for example, Reserva there's certain objective criteria to be able to make those claims on a bottle of wine. So Family Reserve and Rioja Reserva have two completely different meanings. And then these attributes, if there's enough diffusion into the market, enough use of the names, and there's certain objective criteria, they create categories, which are really buckets of products with similar attributes. And there you can see the South African integrity, the IPW seal, which guarantees region, variety, and vintage, but also that the practices do comply with certain environmental standards. And so that the categories are formed. So not to get too complex, but the why they're important and the whole idea around subcategories is becoming very important, especially in the context of South Africa, where our per liter export price is actually much lower than the other 11 mainstream wine producers. So France, Italy, Spain, New Zealand, Argentina, Chile, Australia, especially in the global South, South Africa has a low price point. But for example, Old Vineyards has a premium status, as we'll show. And really, this is because markets have two dimensions. They have a vertical dimension, which is about your status. That's your social standing in the market. And then on the other side, it has a horizontal dimension, which is about identity. So your identity as a country brand is, for example, really promoted by having high value subcategories as part of the identity. So it just puts into a little bit the perspective on how important subcategories are in performing the country brand. And that's because categories are often nested in each other. For example, like in a Russian doll, where categories sort of stack into each other like that. So just the high-level results of our study. We were able, through a hedonic pricing model, to calculate the worth of each Q on a bottle of wine. The most important result for us was that each year that the vine was in the ground, it added £2.96, and various data collections since there, that has remained more or less the same. For example, one wine searcher rating score out of 100 added 65, 62 to each bottle of wine. And what was really interesting was that when all wines were mentioned on the back label, it had a premium effect of around 65 Rand, and yet on the front label, it actually had a discounting effect. Now, this is what kind of confounded us for some time, but our thinking is that when it's woven into the story on the back label, it acquires more worth. Whereas the front label is reserved for sort of legal information, so the brand name, the variety, and so forth that are guaranteed. But this was likely to change with the introduction of the Certified Heritage Vineyard Seal, which came in 2018, and was partly performed by the trackings and tracing system that the South African Wine Industry Information and Systems have on old vineyards. So we are able to trace vineyards planting dates back to 1900. And so that really helped for them to be able to really certify that a vineyard or vineyards that were used in making the wine were of a certain age. So I think it's important to understand that three things drive premiums. The first is status. As I mentioned, it's social standing. It's very difficult to change that, and certain categories have a higher status than others. The other is reputation, and that's sort of based on quality track record over time. So critic scores like Wine Searcher, which is an algorithm from a whole bunch of wine critic scores that really gives you a single rating for each wine. We found that to be a good indicator of track record, and that generates sort of earned rewards for producers. But very importantly, image is the categories that you associate with. So when we go back to that visual on the market, we're able to see there that the categories as a country brand, for example, or as an industry that your wines associate with, can have a big impact on the price that you can charge and the value that you can command for your product. So what we did is we looked at Chenin Blanc, which is 50% of all vineyards in South Africa are Chenin Blanc. And South Africa also has around 53% of the Chenin Blanc vineyards across the globe. So it's a very important category. But what we found, and it wasn't only true to South Africa, is that it had a relatively low status. So it was seen as a workhorse grape with neutral taste. And so it had a commodifying effect. There was a kind of mediocrity in the way that it was perceived, and it was sort of in obscurity. So we did this by a qualitative analysis of around over 500 or 600 news articles and also the top 100 wine influencers across the globe, and we extracted and we themed all their comments on Chenin Blanc. And then what that led to is a sort of discounting effect. But this was before we went and had a look after, because we had we had done the same thing with the old vine category and saw that it had quite an elevated status. And what happened over time is because of the association between Chenin Blanc and Old Vineyard category, the Chenin Blanc category actually, the perception towards it changed, and we're seeing that the old vine category was serving to reinterpret the Chenin Blanc category, and we foresee that this is going to change going forward, and that the Chenin Blanc category will raise in status and value because of the influence of the old vineyard category. So there was a sense of this renaissance happening with Chenin Blanc. This is in addition to the fact that the Chenin Blanc Association in South Africa has also done an incredible job in creating awareness and also then focusing also on the old vine story, which is really important in elevating that category. So very interesting studies that we've just done, because we looked at it from the producer-consumer point of view, where the producer had confidence in the queue in the old vineyard category. But we wanted to understand from consumers what drove their behavior towards old vine. So the difference in the approach was that how hedonic pricing model actually made the assumption that if the wine is on the shelf for that price, people are prepared to pay that price. But we wanted to go and see and ask consumers what they thought and what drove their behavior. So we looked at it from various levels, and we sent out a survey. We got a few hundred responses, and we were able to do a model to understand what was driving this old vineyard behavior. And so we looked at the consumer response system, and we were surprised. And well, we were surprised and we weren't surprised, because we knew it was a premium category, and it shared certain similarities with, for example, luxury wine categories. So two of the main things from a psychological perspective, these are subconscious, non-category specific predispositions that people have towards choosing certain products. So you can look at the need for nostalgia, or the predisposition towards the nostalgia. That means thinking things that were better then than now. And you look at that in the context of retro brands, that's why people are attracted towards that. So there were two factors or two variables that really played a role in driving people's proneness, or consumers' proneness, towards buying old vine category wines. But there is also this concept of resonance. So that's a conscious response. That's a connection between yourself and a particular category. And we found that these were really wants. So these are conscious category-specific wishes. So there were four sort of drivers of this. Quality recognition, really important. Once again, a perceived rarity. And then the connection to the category. Does this category represent who I am? And do I connect with it on an emotional level? Do I connect with it on a brand community level? And do I connect with on what we call a self-expressive level? And then perceived rarity, and very importantly, self-transcendence, transcendent value, which I'll touch on in a couple of minutes. And transcendent value is different from hedonic value. Transcendent value means that it speaks to the moral compass. So there's something about old vines that has a moral story which people really resonate with. And that performs their probability to purchase. So we found that there was a high probability, if proneness and resonance were present, that people would purchase the wine. And why is this important? Because one can segment the market. One can understand what are the marketing triggers for people in old vines. We would like to expand the study to make it a little bit more robust and also a far greater international audience. But I guess the results won't differ all that much. what really was interesting was that there was this whole idea about desires, and desires are sort of passions. And so the more involved, the more quality conscious people were, and the more familiar they were with old vine wines, or the category, they engaged in what we call a quest. And that increased their probability to purchase the wine. So they call that the fire by desire. So consumers are in that high involvement section more prepared to purchase wines if they are more involved, if they are more quality orientated, and if they are familiar with the category. So just want to touch on before I start closing off is that this idea of transcendent value is becoming very important, and that especially with younger generations of consumers. So there's three types of value that are important for us to consider. Is firstly commodity value, and that's just on by supply and demand on the mercy of the market. But the more you differentiate your product with, for example, associating it with a category, with a story like Old Vineyards, you create hedonic value. People choose a product or a wine based on whether it's got an old vine association, it's part of the category or not. Same with a certain variety or of a certain vintage or in a certain region, for example. But transcendent value is very different because new generations of consumers are not loyal in the same way they were for previous generations. So provenance, for example, doesn't count as much, but what does count is it aligns with my moral compass. And that's why the sustainability conversation is incredibly important in the old vines category. So the interesting part of that is, and I'm reading a lot more literature around that, is that new generations, millennial, Gen Z, are prepared to pay more if it speaks to their moral compass. So globally, there's a decline in wine consumption. So I think it's gone down from in 2000 to about 4.4 liters per capita globally to under 3. But there is this propensity to spend more and drink wine if it speaks to this moral compass, if it has that blended value which contains a value proposition which takes into account people and planet. I see there's a regenerative farming session later. That's a super important discussion. And the danger here is what we call window dressing or lack of sincerity, not walking the talk. So that's all fine and well to say the old vines give you an edge in terms of environmental and social purpose and creates this amazing blended value proposition. But, is that what you're really doing? And then the other question is the money that you're creating in that exchange in selling old vine wines at a higher price, is it going down to the point of action, which is really rural communities and growers who are in not such a great position? I think 30% of South African growers are making a loss. So that extra money needs to go down the value chain and land where it can have the greatest impact. And I think that's a really big discussion and sort of part of the take-homes of this presentation. So I think one needs to look at how new generations of consumer are approaching drinking wine and how they resonate with the category, and what sort of transcendent value does the old vine category provide globally that can speak to these new sensibilities in the market. So I think some take-home messages. Obviously, we've done some neuro marketing research, and I think that would be great to discuss. It just takes that consumer response system study to a little bit more level of detail in terms of conscious versus subconscious response. But I think one of the key measures is, and what the Old Wine Project category does provide South African wine producers with, is getting the right price for their product. And in this sense, category and subcategory associations are critical. So research shows, just to summarize, that producers place price importance on old vine category wine, South African old vine category wine. This generates additional premiums for wine producers. And then consumers attach value to old vine category wines. And interestingly, they attach a transcendent value to it. And this occurs from a conscious level to a subconscious level. So overall, old vines is a high status premium category that influences the status of other associated categories, or has the potential to do so. But as I said, value must reach a point of action. It must provide impact for growers, for producers, and more importantly, for the communities that they support. That value needs to be unlocked to have social and environmental impact. It's much cheaper to farm conventionally and not have an impact on your rural communities. And that additional value that's created needs to reach that point of impact. And I think some of the things that we're looking at now very carefully is how new generations of consumers are prepared to pay more for transcendent value, or value that speaks to their moral compass. I think this is becoming really important in the global world of wine, certainly in mature markets like the US and in many European markets. So I hope that sheds some light on where we're going and what we've been doing. There's a lot of research that we are busy with, and hopefully it's helping the Old Wine Project in South Africa and also the global category to understand some of the important things to consider when going forward. But thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonathan. I have a question which is digging down into the transcendent value.
Yes.
And relating that to the established category of fair trade. So fair trade is a category that's been around for a while. It has a solid grounding in many markets,
Yes.
but it doesn't seem to ignite in quite the same way as this sort of transcendent space. How would you categorize and define where they overlap and how they're different?
Okay, now I would have tended to agree with you about a year and a half ago, because there's certainly some studies that, because then you've got the cost associated with fair trade certification, right? And if you're not getting any value, then, you know, is it fulfilling the purpose? Now, I would have agreed with you to say, well, has it had the price importance of, say, the old vineyard category? And interestingly, I was just looking at a study from the other day that's been recently published that is showing that's changing. And so fair trade and also a social impact, like, for example, in so AWITA certification and audits, social audits are also having an impact on consumer prices that consumers are prepared to pay. So I think that's changing. It might take a while still to start having that big effect, because, you know, how many out of all the wine drinkers, how many are these new generation, and how is that going to change and going forward? So I think there is, for me, some light at the end of the tunnel with regard to fair trade. So I think with environmental certification, also one needs to consider the impact of biodynamic certification or eco certification. How important are they going to become? in addition to the social side of it. So I think the answer is the jury is still out, but it looks like it's heading in the right direction. And it also depends on the market. The market is on whether people place greater emphasis on it in their purchasing decisions and the price they're prepared to pay. So if you look at across Europe, each of our major markets might be different compared to, for example, the US. But I've been listening to a lot of podcasts in the US, and it's a super interesting subject in itself. And I guess we could go on the whole day. But yes, I think there is a change beginning to happen as far as I can see from research that's coming in. Yeah.
Thank
Sarah,
you.
may I add something there, Sarah?
Of course.
I also think that something else that does play into this is, do people walk the talk? And I know that, having worked with some major retail chains and people working in sustainability a few years ago in retail, a lot of the people place sustainability and fair trade high up on their priorities when they're interviewed about what informs their purchasing decision. And yet when they get to the checkout counter, suddenly it's the brand that was on sale and how much was this one, and it's how much pounds they actually have in their pocket or what the balance on their credit card is. So it's a really interesting one to track. It's going to be fascinating to see how this unfolds. But I also note that I believe it's accreditations for B Corp have started increasing dramatically lately. So that does play into the fact that people are placing more on transcendency values.
Yeah.
Question from Jeremy Moss. Does the cover all segments of the market, or just in terms of wealth, the top 2 to 5%?
Good question. We actually asked the question because we did our, just as luck would have it, we started collecting data during the middle. We weren't aware that COVID was going to have an impact. So we were kind of facing all these alcohol bans. And one of the questions we did ask was whether financial well-being had any impact on it. So it does look like the segment that answered the survey was definitely probably a little bit more affluent. But we did ask education. They were kind of highly educated, so likely they would be more in that market. So a bigger sample probably would have a different impact. But financial well-being had very little to do with their choice. I said we had to test it. I had it tested and then retested. Still no significance. So it didn't have an impact. So quite likely this is a premium or luxury segment. And then the question is, well, is old wine category likely to become mainstream, more mass market, or is it always going to be a sort of niche, a specialty, a luxury, a premium category kind of thing?
Fantastic. Jonathan, we've also had a request for Francisca Vanzella, who will be speaking later, for a recommendation for a couple of those podcasts you mentioned. So if we could connect and I could send them out, or feel free to put them in the chat.
Sure.
I've got one more quick question, which is that, do you see the rise of sustainable luxury, which is obviously a trend that's happening certainly in the UK and I think the US as well, where really traditionally heritage luxury brands have realized that they cannot sustain that positioning without putting sustainability front of their offer? Do you think this is indicative of it's kind of almost a change in the way in which fair trade and sustainable and organic products are being understood, rather than being sort of, hippies in sandals? It's actually blending into a different category.
Yeah, I think, as I said, categories nest within each other, right? Like a Russian doll. They sort of stack into it, and sort of as a sort of palette of what you can produce, Let's attach old vineyards, let's attach, sustainability. Interesting conversations I've been having is that a lot of guys are seeing sustainability as an outdated word, in a sense, because there's so much damage that conventional agriculture has done. Is it enough because sustainability, suggests we've got something to sustain. So maybe we need to look at, and that's why the conversation with regenerative is to regenerate, or how do we look at social justice? How do we attract people from other, a diverse set of consumers? And that's all in the same, how do we decolonize wine terms, for example? I know Kathy was quite involved with Chenin Blanc, that's done some work on that, super interesting stuff. And maybe one needs to look at it that is, it's not just about sustaining, it's about actually turning things around and reversing what we've done. So I think that's a different challenge to what it is just to try and stay afloat, or try and just be known for being sustainable in order to sell more wine to a luxury category. And
Yes.
that's back down to the sincerity of the walking the talk situation that Kathy was talking about it as well.
Thank you. I'd just like to bring in one more comment from Etienne Niesling, who is actually also going to be joining one of our panels.
He just sent me a WhatsApp. So
Has he? And he actually said the same thing I wanted to ask you. So his point, we see in France, where the old vine category is not objectively controlled, the term old vine or vieille vin doesn't have the same value. And this related to your point that a claim without certification can actually serve to reduce value.
Exactly.
So
this I think was the problem when we first started studying it, is because claims that don't have an objective standard attached, how can you trust that? The issue in France is that it's a huge country. It's like the #1 wine producer in terms of value, volume. And, they've got Burgundy, Loire, Bordeaux. Their data is not centralized. So that's the advantage with South Africa, is that it's a relatively small industry, mostly located in the Western Cape, and with a really good traceability system. So we're able to get back. And sort of that's a bigger question, is because how do you do it in terms of, this is a Loire old vine, is it a Bordeaux old vine, or is there a French common standard that everybody can use, that everybody agrees on, that they're prepared to certify their wines? So that's a big question. So I think it's back at him to tell me.
Well, Jonathan, you may regret this, but actually tomorrow we have a session. I'm in conversation with some leading old vine practitioners in France. And one of the paradoxes of France, of course, is that it has this incredible richness in different regions of association with heritage cues and sincere, genuine heritage. But in fact, in terms of a collective category emerging to talk about their old vine wines, they are not at the forefront. And would you perhaps be interested in a collaboration with some French producers?
Sure. Yeah. Would be lovely. For me, I'm very passionate about it. I've been researching it for a few years, and the more I know about it, and the more I engage with producers and thought leaders around the globe, the more it adds richness to my research. I think that's something they're going to figure out. I have chatted to a few of them with through the OIV. And so I think that's something that they're going to have to look at. But my question is also, do they need it? Some producers probably need it more than others, but it certainly does add value. So if they can find out, if they can overcome that hurdle, then obviously great for them. But I think it'll be very challenging in a country like France with all that richness and that heritage and everything else, you know.
Fascinating. Jonathan and Kathy, thank you so much, not just for this presentation, but for your role in this really global leadership that South Africa has played for 20 years, obviously under the leadership of Rosa Kruger in developing this category.
This has been another episode of Exploring the Wine Glass. Thanks for listening. If you have suggestions on what topics you would like me to discuss, please reach out on social media. You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as Exploring the Wine Glass. I am also on LinkedIn as Lori Hoyt-Butt. Of course, you can always email me at exploringthewineglass@gmail.com and sign up for my newsletter at exploringthewineglass.com. If you enjoyed what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe to help others find me more easily. And most importantly, tell your wine-loving friends, because if you like the podcast, they will too. Podcast music is Wine by Kevins. Until next week, sláinte!
Never let you go. Never let you go. I want a nice glass right now.